Captain James Thornberry stood outside the inquiry room, his hands clasped behind his back. 23 years of service had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but today was different. Today he was about to break a silence that had protected the royal family for generations. The morning had started like any other November day in London. Cold wind, gray skies, and the usual rush of people heading to work. But for James, this morning would change everything. He had been called to testify about something that happened 3 years ago, something he had kept locked away in his memory, hoping he would never have to speak about it. James was not just any guard. He was one of the most respected officers in the Queen's Guard. People who worked with him often said he was like a statue, standing perfectly still for hours without showing any emotion. He had seen everything during his years of service. He had stood guard during royal weddings, state funerals, and visits from world leaders. Through it all, he never spoke about what he saw or heard. That was the code. That was the way things worked. But some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. Some things, when left unsaid, can cause more damage than the truth ever could. James had wrestled with this decision for 3 long years. He had lost sleep over it, spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was doing the right thing. The inquiry room door opened, and a young clerk called his name. James walked in, his boots clicking against the marble floor. The room was smaller than he expected, with wood-paneled walls and a long table where 3 officials sat. They looked up at him with serious faces. This was not going to be easy. One of the officials, an older woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, asked him to state his name and position. James did so, his voice steady and clear. Then came the question he had been dreading. "Captain Thornberry, can you tell us what happened during President Trump's state visit in July 3 years ago?" James took a deep breath. This was it. There was no going back now. He began to speak, choosing his words carefully. He explained that he had been on duty that evening, posted outside one of the private reception rooms in Buckingham Palace. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, just another night of standing guard while important people talked inside. But what he heard that night was anything but routine. It was something that went against everything the royal family stood for, something that could damage the relationship between 2 of the world's most powerful nations. James explained that he had always kept private notes as part of his security duties. It was standard practice for senior guards to document anything unusual during their shifts. These notes were meant to be confidential, used only if there was ever a security review. He never imagined they would become evidence in an official inquiry. As he spoke, James could feel the weight of what he was doing. He was not just sharing information, he was breaking a trust that had existed for hundreds of years. The Royal Guard was supposed to be invisible, silent, loyal above all else. By speaking up, he was violating that sacred code, but James had a different view of loyalty. To him, real loyalty meant protecting the institution, not covering up things that could harm it. He had thought about this every single day for 3 years. He had asked himself over and over, what is the right thing to do? Stay silent and protect the code, or speak up and protect something bigger? The officials at the table leaned forward, listening intently. One of them, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, asked James why he had waited so long to come forward. It was a fair question, and James had prepared his answer. He explained that he had initially filed a report with his superiors, following proper protocol. But the report seemed to disappear into the system. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked questions. It was as if everyone wanted to forget the incident ever happened. For a while, James tried to do the same. He told himself that maybe it wasn't as serious as he thought. Maybe he was overreacting. But then he started seeing news reports about similar incidents. He heard former White House staff members talking about how difficult some of those visits had been. He read articles about diplomatic tensions that seemed to have no clear explanation, and he realized that his silence might be part of a bigger problem. James told the inquiry that he had consulted with military lawyers before deciding to testify. He wanted to make sure he was not breaking any laws or putting national security at risk. The lawyers had assured him that what he witnessed was a matter of public interest, not classified information. That gave him the confidence to move forward. Still, the decision had torn him apart. James was a man of tradition. He believed in honor, duty, and keeping your word. But he also believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The woman with the sharp eyes asked him to describe the incident in detail. James nodded and began to recount that July evening. He could remember it like it was yesterday. The smell of fresh flowers in the hallway, the sound of classical music playing softly in the background, the nervous energy of the staff preparing for an important event. He had been standing at his post for about an hour when he heard raised voices coming from inside the room. That was unusual. State visits were carefully choreographed events where everyone was always polite and diplomatic. Loud voices meant something had gone wrong. James could not see inside the room, but he could hear clearly. The walls were thick, but the voices were loud enough to carry through the heavy wooden doors. He recognized President Trump's distinctive voice immediately. The president sounded frustrated, almost angry. What James heard next would haunt him for years to come. It was not just what was said, but how it was said. The tone, the pressure, the complete disregard for protocol and tradition. It was the kind of conversation that should never happen between a visiting head of state and a member of the royal family. James finished his testimony and sat back in his chair. The room was silent for a moment. The three officials exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Then they thanked him for his service and his honesty. The inquiry would continue, they said, and he might be called back for further questions. As James left the building, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He had done what he believed was right, but he knew the consequences would be severe. His life was about to change in ways he could not fully imagine. The media would find out. His fellow guards would judge him. His family would face scrutiny. But as he walked through the cold London streets, James held his head high. He had spent his entire career standing at attention, following orders, keeping secrets. Today, for the first time in 23 years, he had stepped forward and spoken his truth. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same courage and integrity that had defined his service. The testimony was out there now, and there was no taking it back. The words had been spoken, and they would shake the foundations of two nations. Captain James Thornberry had done his duty, not by staying silent, but by finding the courage to speak. The inquiry room fell silent as Captain James Thornberry opened his leather notebook. His hands were steady, but inside his heart was racing. For 3 years he had kept these notes locked away, never showing them to anyone except his military lawyers. Now he was about to reveal exactly what happened on that July evening. James cleared his throat and began to describe the scene. It was July 13th, around 8 in the evening. The sun was still setting outside, casting a golden glow through the palace windows. He had been assigned to guard the yellow drawing room, one of the most beautiful rooms in Buckingham Palace. It was a prestigious assignment, usually given to the most trusted guards. The evening had started normally enough. President Trump had arrived for a private reception with senior members of the royal family. There were supposed to be about 20 people in the room, all carefully selected guests. Security had been planned down to the minute. Everyone knew their role, their position, their responsibilities. James stood outside the main entrance to the drawing room, his back straight, his eyes forward. He could hear the pleasant murmur of conversation inside, the gentle clinking of glasses, the occasional polite laughter. This was what state visits were supposed to be like. Dignified, respectful, carefully managed, but then something changed. James noticed that President Trump had left the main group. Through the slight gap in the doorway, he could see the president walking toward a quieter corner of the room. One of the senior royals was standing there alone, looking at a painting on the wall. What happened next was something James would never forget. The president approached the royal family member and started talking in a low voice. At first, James thought nothing of it. People have private conversations at parties all the time. But then the president's voice got louder and louder. James could hear almost every word now. President Trump was not making small talk about the weather or the palace artwork. He was talking about politics, about elections, about power. He was doing something that absolutely should not happen during a state visit. According to James's testimony, the president started pushing the royal to make a public statement supporting his re-election campaign. He said it would be really great and very helpful if the royal family would show their support. He talked about how much America had done for Britain, how the special relationship between the two countries deserved some recognition. The royal family member, clearly uncomfortable, tried to politely change the subject. They reminded the president that the monarchy does not get involved in politics. especially not in the politics of other countries. It is a fundamental rule, one of the most important principles of the modern British monarchy. But President Trump did not seem to accept this answer. James heard him say that rules could be bent, that a simple statement of friendship would not really be political. He suggested that such support would be remembered when it came time to negotiate trade deals after Brexit. Britain needed America, he said, and America needed friends who were willing to stand up and be counted. James felt his stomach tighten as he listened. This was completely wrong. Foreign leaders were never supposed to pressure members of the royal family like this. The whole point of constitutional monarchy was that royals stayed out of politics. They represented the nation as a whole, not any particular party or political position. The conversation continued for several more minutes. James could hear the royal family member trying again and again to politely refuse, to redirect the conversation, to escape without causing a diplomatic incident. But the president kept pushing, kept insisting, kept making his case, then things got worse. According to James's notes, President Trump's tone changed. He sounded frustrated, almost angry. He said something that James would later describe as deeply inappropriate and disrespectful to the institution of the monarchy. The president suggested that the royal family was outdated and needed to adapt to modern times. He said that in America, people did not bow to anyone, and maybe Britain needed to think about whether having a king or queen still made sense. He implied that the monarchy's continued existence depended on staying relevant, and that meant being willing to help friends when they asked. James heard the royal family member's voice become firmer. They made it absolutely clear that the monarchy would not be issuing any political statements, and that the president's suggestions were not appropriate. The conversation needed to end now. There was a moment of tense silence. Then James heard footsteps. The president was walking back toward the main group, his shoes clicking hard against the polished floor. The royal family member remained in the corner for a moment, and James could sense their distress even without seeing their face. Within minutes, one of the president's handlers appeared and guided him toward another conversation. The palace staff smoothly managed the rest of the evening, making sure the president and the royal family member were never alone together again. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had happened. The reception continued. Everyone smiled for the cameras, and the official visit proceeded according to schedule. But James knew better. He had witnessed something that could cause a major diplomatic crisis if it ever became public. As soon as his shift ended that night, he went to a private room and wrote down everything he had heard. He noted the time, the location, the exact words he could remember. He did this not because he wanted to cause trouble, but because it was his duty as a security officer to document unusual incidents. The next day, James filed a report with his superior officer. He explained what he had witnessed and expressed his concern that proper protocol had been violated. His superior thanked him for the report and said it would be passed up the chain of command. James assumed that someone would follow up, that there would be questions, that appropriate action would be taken. But weeks went by and nobody said anything. James heard nothing about his report. When he carefully asked his superior about it, he was told that the matter had been handled at the appropriate level, and that he should not discuss it with anyone. The message was clear: forget what you heard and move on. James tried to do exactly that. He went back to his regular duties, standing guard, protecting the royal family, serving with honor and distinction. But he could not forget that conversation. It played in his mind over and over again, especially when he saw news reports about the state visit describing it as a great success. He started keeping track of other news stories about President Trump's interactions with world leaders. He noticed a pattern of behavior that seemed to cross traditional diplomatic boundaries. He read reports from former White House staff who described the president's unconventional approach to foreign relations. Everything James was reading suggested that what he witnessed was not an isolated incident. For months, James struggled with what to do. He talked to his wife about it in general terms without revealing specific details. She could see that something was bothering him, that he was carrying a heavy burden. She encouraged him to do whatever he thought was right, but she also worried about the consequences for their family. James also spoke with a few trusted colleagues, again, without revealing specifics. He asked hypothetical questions about duty and loyalty, about when silence becomes complicity, Most of his fellow guards said that discretion was always the right choice, that their job was to protect the royal family by keeping their secrets, not by exposing them. But James saw it differently. He believed that protecting the institution meant defending its core principles. The monarchy survived because it stayed above politics, because it represented everyone regardless of their political views. If foreign leaders could pressure royals into political positions without consequences, the whole system would be undermined. As he sat in the inquiry room, recounting all of this, James could see the impact his words were having. The officials were taking extensive notes. Their expressions showed a mix of concern, surprise, and determination. This testimony was not just about one uncomfortable conversation. It was about the integrity of the British constitutional system and the boundaries of international diplomacy. James finished describing the incident and closed his notebook. He had said everything he needed to say. The truth was out there now, and whatever happened next was beyond his control. He had done his duty not by staying silent, but by speaking up when silence would have caused greater harm. The leak happened faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, just hours after Captain James Thornbury finished his testimony, news of what he said was already spreading through London like wildfire. Someone in that inquiry room had talked to the press, and now the whole world was about to learn what happened during that state visit 3 years ago. Inside Buckingham Palace, phones started ringing off the hook. Senior advisors rushed from one meeting to another, their faces pale with worry. This was not just any scandal. This was a potential constitutional crisis that could damage the monarchy's reputation and destroy Britain's relationship with America. The palace's communications team gathered in an emergency meeting. They had dealt with difficult situations before, royal divorces, embarrassing photos, family feuds, but this was different. This involved a foreign head of state, diplomatic protocols, and the fundamental principle of royal political neutrality. There was no playbook for handling something like this. The head of communications, a woman who had served the royal family for over 15 years, stood at the front of the room. Her voice was calm, but everyone could see the stress in her eyes. She explained that they had maybe 2 hours before the major news networks started running with the story. They needed a strategy, and they needed it now. The team debated their options. Should they issue a statement denying everything? Should they confirm the incident but downplay its significance? Should they say nothing at all and let the storm pass? Every option seemed to have serious drawbacks. Some advisors argued that silence was the best policy. The royal family never commented on private conversations, they said. Making a statement would only draw more attention to the story and make it seem more important than it was. Better to let the news cycle move on to something else. But others disagreed. They pointed out that this was not just palace gossip. This was testimony from a highly respected guard about a potential violation of constitutional principles. If they stayed silent, people might think they had something to hide. The palace needed to show that it took such matters seriously. As the meeting continued, another problem emerged. The king himself wanted to make a statement. He had been there that night 3 years ago, when he was still the Prince of Wales. He remembered the incident clearly and wanted to set the record straight. But his advisors were terrified of letting him speak publicly about it. The constitutional experts in the room explained why the king's silence was so important. If he confirmed the incident, he would be commenting on political matters, which is exactly what the monarchy is supposed to avoid. But if he denied it, he would be contradicting sworn testimony from one of his own guards. Either way, he would be making things worse. The king was frustrated but eventually agreed to stay silent. However, he insisted that the palace must support Captain Thornbury and make it clear that the guard had done nothing wrong by coming forward. The king believed that protecting the institution meant defending those who defended it, even when they had to speak uncomfortable truths. While the palace struggled with its response, the story was already exploding across social media. People were sharing the news, adding their own opinions, taking sides before they even knew all the facts. Some defended the president, saying the testimony was probably exaggerated or taken out of context. Others were outraged that a foreign leader would try to pressure the royal family into political positions. British newspapers went into overdrive. The Daily Telegraph, traditionally supportive of both the monarchy and conservative politics, found itself in an impossible position. How could they defend both institutions when one had apparently tried to compromise the other? Their editorial team worked late into the night, trying to write an opinion piece that would not alienate half their readers. The Guardian, more liberal in its outlook, saw the story as vindication of their long-standing concerns about President Trump's respect for international norms. Their reporters were already digging for more information, calling sources, trying to find out if there were other similar incidents that had not been reported. Inside the palace, security became a major concern. Threats against Captain Thornberry started appearing online. Some people saw him as a hero, but others viewed him as a traitor who had broken his oath. The palace quietly arranged for additional protection for the captain and his family. The diplomatic implications were also becoming clear. The British ambassador to the United States was summoned back to London for urgent consultations. He would need guidance on how to handle the fallout in Washington, where the story was likely to cause its own political storm. Foreign Office officials were particularly worried about the timing. Britain was still working through complex post-Brexit trade negotiations with America. Any damage to the special relationship could have serious economic consequences. Some officials privately wondered if this testimony would be used as leverage in upcoming negotiations. Protocol experts from around the world started weighing in on the situation. A former British diplomat gave an interview explaining that what Captain Thornberry described would be considered a serious breach of diplomatic etiquette in any circumstances. For it to happen during a state visit made it even more troubling. A professor of constitutional law from Oxford wrote an article explaining why royal political neutrality was so important to British democracy. The monarchy survived, she argued, because it represented the nation as a whole rather than any particular political faction. Any attempt to draw royals into partisan politics threatened the entire system. As evening fell over London, the palace finally issued a brief statement. It confirmed that Captain Thornberry had testified before an official inquiry into diplomatic protocols. It stated that the palace took such matters seriously and that proper procedures were being followed. It declined to comment on the specific allegations, citing the ongoing nature of the inquiry. The statement satisfied almost nobody. Critics said it was too vague, that the palace was hiding behind procedure instead of addressing serious accusations. Supporters of the president said the statement was biased because it did not deny the allegations outright. The palace communications team had known the statement would please no one, but at least it was something. Behind the scenes, palace officials were already planning for the next stages of the crisis. They reached out quietly to trusted journalists, providing background information off the record. They wanted to shape the narrative without appearing to do so publicly. They emphasized that Captain Thornberry was a highly respected officer with an impeccable service record, someone who would never lie or exaggerate. They also started preparing for possible government involvement. If the situation escalated, Parliament might demand answers. There could be calls for a formal investigation, or even a debate about whether state visits needed stricter oversight. The palace needed to be ready for every possibility. Meanwhile, members of the royal family were being briefed on what they could and could not say. They were advised to avoid all questions about the incident, to smile politely and change the subject if reporters asked. Even seemingly innocent comments could be twisted or misinterpreted in the current climate. The younger royals, more comfortable with social media and modern communication, wanted to defend the family publicly. But they were firmly told that this was not a matter for Instagram posts or tweets. This required careful traditional diplomacy, not social media commentary. As the night wore on, the palace settled into what officials called crisis mode. Teams worked in shifts, monitoring news coverage, tracking social media reactions, preparing responses to various scenarios. Nobody was going home early tonight. This was the biggest crisis the monarchy had faced in years, and everyone knew that how they handled the next few days would shape public perception for years to come. In a quiet office on the third floor, one of the senior advisors sat alone, reviewing everything they knew about the incident. They had served the royal family through good times and bad, but this felt different. This was not a family problem that could be managed with apologies and time. This was about fundamental principles, about the role of monarchy in modern democracy, about international relations and diplomatic respect. The advisor thought about Captain Thornberry, standing in that inquiry room, breaking decades of silence to tell the truth. It must have taken incredible courage. The guard had everything to lose and nothing to gain except the knowledge that he had done what he believed was right. As the advisor turned off the lights and prepared to go home for a few hours of rest, they wondered how this would all end. Would the palace weather this storm as it had weathered so many others? Would the relationship with America survive? Would the public understand why this mattered so much? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Buckingham Palace had entered a crisis that would test everything it stood for, and the whole world was watching to see how the ancient institution would handle a very modern scandal. The news hit America during the morning rush hour on the East Coast. By the time people were drinking their first coffee and checking their phones, Captain Thornberry's testimony was trending on every social media platform. The reaction was immediate, explosive, and deeply divided. President Trump's response came within an hour. Sitting at his desk, he posted a series of messages, calling the testimony completely false and another disgraceful attack by people who hate America. He claimed he had never pressured anyone about anything during his state visit to Britain. The whole story, he said, was made up by people who could not accept that he had a great relationship with world leaders. His supporters rallied around him instantly. Conservative news channels ran segments questioning Captain Thornberry's motives and reliability. Why had he waited 3 years to speak up? What did he have to gain from making these accusations now? Was this part of a coordinated effort to damage the president's reputation during an election year? But the story was not going away. By midday, several former White House staffers started speaking to reporters, carefully choosing their words. They did not confirm the specific incident that Thornberry described, but they painted a picture of a president who often became frustrated with traditional diplomatic constraints. One former aide, speaking anonymously to a major newspaper, described how President Trump had repeatedly expressed annoyance that the royal family would not publicly support him. The president believed that personal relationships should translate into public endorsements, the aide explained. He did not understand or accept the concept of constitutional neutrality. Another former official recalled a conversation where the president had said the British monarchy should be more grateful for American military support over the years. He had suggested that if America was protecting Britain, Britain should be willing to help America in return, including during elections. These revelations changed the conversation. It was no longer just about one guard's testimony. It was becoming clear that what Thornberry witnessed was part of a larger pattern of behavior. The president had a fundamentally different view of how diplomatic relationships should work. On Capitol Hill, Democratic members of Congress were demanding answers. Several senators called for a full investigation into whether President Trump had violated any laws or diplomatic protocols during his overseas visits. They wanted to know if similar incidents had occurred with other world leaders. The House Foreign Affairs Committee announced emergency hearings. They planned to call witnesses from the State Department, former ambassadors, and diplomatic protocol experts. The committee chair gave a press conference explaining that this was not about politics. It was about protecting the integrity of American foreign relations. Republican lawmakers were caught in a difficult position. Many of them had supported President Trump through numerous controversies, but this one was different. It involved America's closest ally and touched on constitutional principles that conservatives generally held dear. How could they defend actions that seemed to undermine another nation's democratic institutions? Some Republicans chose to stay quiet, refusing to comment until more information came out. Others tried to change the subject, talking about the president's economic policies or his stance on other issues. A few, particularly those from more moderate districts, expressed concern about the allegations and said they should be taken seriously. The State Department found itself in an impossible situation. Career diplomats were horrified by what the testimony suggested, but they could not say so publicly without contradicting their own president. The official spokesperson gave carefully worded statements about respecting all nations' constitutional frameworks while declining to comment on specific allegations. Behind closed doors, State Department officials were more candid. Several told trusted journalists that Thornberry's testimony rang true, based on their own experiences traveling with the president. They described a leader who often ignored their advice about diplomatic protocols and became impatient with what he saw as outdated formalities. The British ambassador to the United States had one of the most challenging weeks of his career. He fielded calls from American officials, gave interviews to news networks, and tried to calm tensions on both sides. He emphasized that the special relationship between Britain and America was bigger than any single incident, that both nations valued their deep historical ties. But maintaining that diplomatic calm was getting harder. American politicians were taking sides, using the incident to score points in their own domestic battles. Conservative commentators accused Britain of interfering in American politics by allowing this testimony to become public. Liberal voices said the incident proved that President Trump was not fit for office. Network news devoted enormous coverage to the story. CNN brought in royal experts and diplomatic historians to explain why the incident mattered. Fox News featured guests who questioned whether one guard's testimony should be trusted over the word of a sitting president. MSNBC ran segments connecting this incident to other controversial moments in Trump's foreign policy. The debate spread to ordinary Americans as well. At dinner tables and in office break rooms, people argued about whether Thornberry was a hero or a troublemaker. Some saw him as a brave whistleblower standing up for important principles. Others viewed him as someone who had violated his duty and betrayed a confidence. Social media became a battlefield. Hashtags supporting and attacking the president trended simultaneously. People shared their opinions, often without reading the full details of what Thornberry had actually said. Misinformation spread quickly, with some posts claiming things that had never been part of the testimony. Former President Obama made a rare public statement. Without mentioning Trump by name, he talked about the importance of respecting diplomatic protocols and honoring the constitutional systems of allied nations. He emphasized that state visits were built on mutual respect and understanding, not on demands or pressure tactics. This statement only inflamed tensions further. Trump supporters accused Obama of breaking the traditional rule that former presidents do not criticize current ones. They said he was trying to undermine Trump's foreign policy for political reasons. Obama's supporters applauded him for speaking up about principles they believed were under attack. The controversy also affected the upcoming election campaign. Trump's opponents in the race seized on the testimony as evidence of his unfitness for office. They ran ads featuring clips from British news coverage, showing respected British voices expressing concern about what had happened. They argued that America needed a president who understood and respected diplomatic norms. Trump's campaign fought back aggressively. They produced their own ads showing the president meeting with world leaders, emphasizing his strong leadership on the international stage. They framed the controversy as another example of elites trying to undermine a president who challenged the status quo. Independent voters found themselves in a difficult position. Many of them had supported Trump because they liked his unconventional approach to politics. But pressuring the royal family seemed to cross a line. It was not about challenging political correctness or shaking up Washington. It was about respecting another nation's democratic institutions. Polling showed that the incident was having an impact on public opinion. Trump's favorability ratings dipped slightly, particularly among moderate voters and those who valued international alliances. However, his core supporters remained loyal, many of them becoming even more defensive in the face of what they saw as unfair attacks. The controversy also raised questions about future state visits. Some members of Congress suggested that presidents should have stricter oversight during such events. Others proposed that diplomatic protocol violations should be documented and reported to Congress. These ideas gained little traction, but showed how the incident was affecting thinking about presidential conduct abroad. In newsrooms across America, journalists were digging for more stories. Were there other guards or staff members who had witnessed similar incidents? Had Trump behaved this way during visits to other countries? Several investigations were launched, with reporters calling sources around the world trying to piece together a fuller picture. One revelation came from a former staffer at the French embassy. Speaking carefully to avoid diplomatic repercussions, the person suggested that President Trump had also pushed French officials to publicly support his policies during a visit to Paris. The staffer did not provide details but said the incident had caused considerable concern among French diplomats. These additional stories made the situation more complicated. If Thornberry's testimony was part of a pattern, it suggested systemic issues with how the president conducted diplomatic relations. But each new allegation also made it easier for Trump's supporters to claim he was the victim of a coordinated campaign. As days passed, the story remained at the top of news coverage. It had everything that makes a story endure: a dramatic revelation, international intrigue, questions about power and principle, and deep political divisions. Americans could not stop talking about it, even as many wished it would just go away. The State Department quietly started reviewing protocols for presidential visits abroad. James Thornberry woke up to find camera crews parked outside his apartment building. The media had found his address within 24 hours of his testimony becoming public. Reporters called out to him as he stepped outside to get his morning newspaper, asking him how he felt, why he spoke up, what he hoped to achieve. He said nothing, just walked back inside with his head down. This was his life now, and he had known it would be. But knowing something and experiencing it are very different things. The weight of constant scrutiny was heavier than he had imagined. His phone rang constantly. News networks wanted interviews. Publishers wanted book deals. Political groups wanted him to speak at their events. James ignored all of it. He had said what he needed to say to the official inquiry. He was not interested in becoming a celebrity or a political symbol, but the pressure to speak kept growing. His old friends from the military were divided. Some called to express their support, telling him he had done the right thing. Others sent messages saying they were disappointed, that he had broken the code that held their profession together. A few former colleagues stopped returning his calls altogether. The leadership of the Queen's Guard was particularly torn. Officially, they could not comment on ongoing inquiries, but privately, senior officers debated whether James had upheld his oath or violated it. Some argued that his duty to protect the crown included protecting it from diplomatic manipulation. Others insisted that discretion was the highest duty, and that speaking publicly about private matters was always wrong. James received a formal letter from the Guard's administrative office. It was carefully worded, neither praising nor condemning him. The letter simply informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the inquiry. His access to royal residences was suspended, and he was asked to return his security credentials. Reading that letter was one of the hardest moments of his life. The Queen's Guard had been his identity for 23 years. It was not just a job, it was who he was. Being separated from it, even temporarily, felt like losing a part of himself. He sat alone in his apartment holding the letter, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. His wife, Rachel, tried to be supportive, but the strain was showing. Reporters had started calling her at work. Her colleagues asked uncomfortable questions. Their daughter's school friends had seen the news and were talking about it. The family's privacy had vanished overnight. One evening, Rachel sat James down for a serious conversation. She told him she understood why he had testified. She believed he had done it for the right reasons. But she also needed him to understand what this was costing their family. She was not sure how much more of this attention she could handle. James felt his heart breaking. He had spent 3 years agonizing over his decision, trying to do what was right. He had consulted with lawyers, talked to ethical advisors, even spoken with a priest about his moral obligations. But in all that time, he had perhaps not fully considered what it would mean for the people he loved. He apologized to Rachel, telling her he wished he could protect her from all of this. She held his hand and said she knew he was a good man who had made a difficult choice, but she also asked him to promise that if things got worse, if the pressure became too much, he would consider leaving London for a while. Maybe they could stay with her parents in Scotland, away from the cameras and the constant questions. James agreed, though he hoped it would not come to that. He did not want to run away or hide. He had spoken the truth, and he wanted to face the consequences with dignity. The BBC reached out with a different kind of request. They wanted to do one comprehensive interview with James, something that would allow him to explain his decision in his own words. The producer promised it would be respectful, focused on the principles involved rather than the sensational details. They would not pay him, but they would give him a chance to tell his story properly. James thought about it for several days. He talked to his lawyers, who said it was his choice but advised caution. He talked to Rachel, who said she would support whatever he decided. Finally, he agreed to do the interview, on the condition that it would be his only one. After this, he would return to private life and say nothing more. The interview was conducted in a quiet studio, just James and a veteran journalist known for her fair and thoughtful approach. She asked him about his background, his service, and what had led him to testify. James spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. He explained that he had not wanted to become a public figure or to damage anyone's reputation. He had simply witnessed something that he believed violated fundamental principles, and after 3 years of struggling with it, he had concluded that speaking up was the right thing to do. The journalist asked him about loyalty. Was not loyalty about keeping confidences, protecting those you serve? James nodded slowly and said yes, loyalty was important, but loyalty to an institution, he explained, sometimes meant protecting what that institution stood for, not just protecting its image. The monarchy survived because it maintained certain principles. If those principles were compromised and nobody spoke up, the institution itself would eventually be undermined. He talked about the personal cost of his decision. He admitted that he had lost friends, that his family was struggling, that he might lose his career. His voice wavered slightly when he talked about returning his security credentials. But he maintained that he would make the same choice again, because some truths were too important to hide. The journalist asked if he felt like a whistleblower. James paused before answering. He said he did not think of himself that way. Whistleblowers typically expose wrongdoing for public benefit. He had simply answered questions truthfully when called to testify. If that made him a whistleblower, so be it, but he had not set out to blow any whistles. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked what he hoped people would understand about his decision. James looked directly at the camera and spoke from the heart. He said he hoped people would understand that this was not about politics or taking sides. It was about respecting boundaries that existed for good reasons. It was about preserving institutions that had served their countries well for centuries. When the interview aired, reaction was mixed, but generally more sympathetic than James had expected. Many viewers were moved by his sincerity and his obvious struggle with the decision. Even some people who disagreed with his choice to testify admitted that he seemed like a decent man, trying to do what he thought was right. But the interview also brought new attention and new problems. Political groups tried to claim him as a symbol for their causes. Some wanted to make him a hero of constitutional principles. Others wanted to portray him as a victim of an oppressive system that punished truth-tellers. James rejected all of these attempts to use his story for political purposes. The threats against him increased after the interview. Most were just angry messages from people who disagreed with what he had done, but a few were serious enough that police had to get involved. Security officers came to his apartment to assess the risks and recommend precautions. They installed additional locks and suggested he vary his daily routines. James found himself becoming paranoid, looking over his shoulder, wondering if that person on the street corner was a journalist or something worse. This was not the life he had imagined when he joined the Queen's Guard. He had wanted to serve quietly, to be part of something larger than himself. Now he was the center of international attention, and he hated it. His fellow guards were also facing consequences. Several were questioned about whether they had known what James was planning to do. Some were asked if they had witnessed similar incidents and failed to report them. The entire culture of the Guard was being examined, questioned, challenged. Some younger guards told James privately that they admired his courage. They said the old code of absolute silence was outdated, that guards should be able to speak up about serious problems without fear of punishment. But older guards saw it differently. They worried that James had opened a door that should have stayed closed, that now guards would feel free to gossip about the royal family to advance their own interests. James understood both perspectives. He did not want to destroy the culture of discretion that made the Queen's Guard effective. But he also believed that discretion should not become a shield for wrongdoing. Finding the right balance was difficult, and he did not claim to have all the answers. As weeks passed, James settled into a strange new normal. He stopped reading news articles about himself because they were too painful. He avoided social media entirely. He tried to focus on simple things, reading books, taking walks, spending quiet time with his family. Rachel noticed that he was becoming depressed. He had always been a man of action, someone who took pride in his work and his purpose. Now he spent his days waiting, wondering if he would ever be allowed to return to the job he loved or if his career was effectively over. She encouraged him to talk to a counselor, someone who could help him process everything he was going through. James was resistant at first, seeing it as a sign of weakness, but eventually he agreed, and the counseling sessions did help. They gave him a space to talk about his feelings without judgment, to work through his doubts and fears. In universities across Britain, constitutional law professors were having the most engaging discussions they had experienced in years. Captain Thornberry's testimony had turned a theoretical principle into a real, urgent question. What happens when foreign leaders try to manipulate the political neutrality of constitutional monarchies? Professor Helen Davies at Oxford University found herself fielding calls from journalists every single day. They all wanted to know the same thing. Did what President Trump allegedly did violate British constitutional law? The answer, she explained patiently in interview after interview, was complicated. Britain does not have a single written constitution like America does. Instead, it has constitutional principles built up over centuries through laws, court decisions, and traditions. One of the most fundamental principles is that the monarch and the royal family must stay above politics. They cannot endorse political parties or interfere in elections, either in Britain or anywhere else. This principle goes back to the 1701 Act of Settlement and has been reinforced countless times since then. The monarchy survived in Britain while falling in many other countries, precisely because it learned to be neutral, to represent the entire nation rather than any particular faction. Professor Davies explained that what made the Thornberry testimony so significant was that it involved foreign pressure on this neutrality. If the allegations were true, a foreign head of state had tried to compromise one of the foundations of British constitutional democracy. That was not just a diplomatic faux pas. It was an attack on the constitutional order itself. Legal scholars debated whether there were any actual laws that had been broken. Technically, the president had not violated British law. He was a foreign visitor, not subject to British constitutional requirements. But the royal family member involved would have violated constitutional principles if they had agreed to the president's request. The pressure itself, even if unsuccessful, was deeply problematic. Some legal experts argued that there should be laws specifically protecting constitutional monarchies from this kind of foreign interference. They pointed out that election interference laws existed to protect democratic processes, but there were no equivalent protections for the political neutrality of constitutional institutions. Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee announced it would examine the incident as part of a broader review of state visit protocols. The committee's chair, a respected member with decades of parliamentary experience, explained that they needed to understand whether current procedures were adequate to prevent such situations. The committee called witnesses from the Foreign Office, the royal household, and diplomatic protocol experts. They wanted to know who was responsible for ensuring that visiting leaders understood and respected British constitutional principles. They wanted to know what happened when those principles were violated. The testimony revealed some uncomfortable truths. Several diplomats admitted that they had witnessed foreign leaders, not just President Trump, making inappropriate requests or suggestions to members of the royal family. In most cases, these were gently deflected without creating incidents, but the diplomats acknowledged that there was no formal mechanism for reporting or addressing such behavior. One former ambassador testified that the assumption had always been that gentlemen understood the rules and would follow them without being told. But in an era of populist leaders who deliberately challenged traditional norms, that assumption no longer held. New, clearer protocols were needed. In America, constitutional scholars were examining the issue from a different angle. Had President Trump violated any American laws or constitutional provisions? The question centered on something called the Logan Act, an old law that prohibits unauthorized citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. But presidents are obviously authorized to conduct foreign relations, so the Logan Act did not apply. Some legal experts suggested that Trump might have violated the spirit, if not the letter, of constitutional provisions regarding respect for foreign sovereignty. The Constitution assumes that the president will conduct foreign policy in a manner that respects other nations' governmental systems. Trying to manipulate another country's constitutional institutions could be seen as contrary to that assumption. But proving a constitutional violation would be extremely difficult. Presidents have broad authority in foreign affairs, and courts are generally reluctant to second-guess diplomatic decisions. Unless Congress acted to limit presidential behavior in this area, there was little legal recourse. This led to discussions about whether new laws were needed. Several members of Congress proposed legislation that would require reports to Congress whenever presidential conduct during state visits raised constitutional concerns. Other proposals suggested creating an independent diplomatic conduct review board. These proposals went nowhere politically, but they showed how seriously some people took the constitutional implications of the incident. They were asking fundamental questions about the limits of presidential power and the obligations America had toward its allies' governmental systems. International law experts also weighed in on the debate. They pointed out that there are established norms of diplomatic conduct, codified in treaties like the Vienna Convention. While these norms do not specifically address pressure on constitutional monarchies, they do establish principles of respect for host nations' internal affairs. If a pattern of such behavior could be established, some experts argued it could potentially violate international diplomatic norms. This would not carry criminal penalties, but it could damage a nation's diplomatic standing and make other countries less willing to extend hospitality to its leaders. The United Nations Protocol Office quietly issued new guidance for member states. Without mentioning the Thornberry incident specifically, the guidance emphasized the importance of respecting host nations' constitutional frameworks during state visits. It recommended that visiting leaders receive briefings not just on customs and etiquette, but on constitutional principles that should not be challenged. Back in Britain, the incident sparked a broader debate about the role of monarchy in the 21st century. Some Republicans, people who believe Britain should abolish the monarchy and become a full republic, argued that the whole situation showed why having a royal family was problematic. If the institution was so fragile that one conversation could threaten it, maybe it was time to move on. But defenders of the monarchy made exactly the opposite argument. They said the incident proved how important the neutrality principle was, and why it needed to be protected. Constitutional monarchy provided stability and continuity, precisely because it stayed above political fights. Losing that would make Britain's political system more volatile and partisan. The debate extended to other constitutional monarchies as well. In countries like Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, people discussed whether their own royal families were adequately protected from similar pressure. Some countries began reviewing their protocols and considering whether additional safeguards were needed. Canadian constitutional experts noted that their situation was particularly complex. Canada shares a monarch with Britain, so anything affecting the British monarchy's political neutrality could have implications for Canada as well. They wondered whether Canada needed its own specific protections beyond what Britain provided. Academic journals filled with articles analyzing every aspect of the situation. Political scientists wrote about the changing nature of diplomatic norms in the populist era. Historians examined past incidents where foreign leaders had tested the boundaries of royal neutrality. Sociologists studied public reactions and what they revealed about attitudes toward tradition and authority. Several universities organized symposiums and conferences dedicated to discussing the constitutional implications. These events brought together scholars from multiple disciplines, diplomats, legal experts, and even former members of royal households. The conversations were rich and nuanced, exploring questions that went far beyond the specific incident. One particularly interesting debate centered on the role of staff and security personnel in protecting constitutional principles. James Thornberry had been a guard, not a constitutional officer. Did people in such positions have a duty to speak up about violations of constitutional norms? Or should they leave such matters to others? Some argued that everyone who serves constitutional institutions has a responsibility to protect them. Others worried that empowering guards and staff to make constitutional judgments could lead to abuse or overreach. The line between protecting an institution and interfering in its operations was not always clear. These debates also touched on the tension between confidentiality and accountability. Democratic institutions need some privacy to function effectively. Leaders need to be able to have frank conversations without worrying that every word will be publicized. But there also needs to be accountability when lines are crossed. Finding the right balance between these competing values was difficult. Too much transparency could paralyze decision-making and eliminate necessary confidentiality. Too much secrecy could allow abuses to continue unchecked. The Thornberry case illustrated this tension perfectly. Nobody expected what happened next. The political landscape began shifting in ways that confused traditional observers and created partnerships that seemed impossible just weeks before. The Thornberry testimony had somehow managed to create common ground among people who usually agreed on nothing. In Britain, traditional conservatives who had generally admired President Trump's economic policies found themselves in an awkward position. They liked his approach to trade, his skepticism of regulation, his willingness to challenge establishment thinking, but they could not defend his alleged behavior toward the monarchy. For these conservatives, the royal family was a sacred institution, a symbol of national continuity and traditional values. The idea that a foreign leader, even one they generally supported, had tried to compromise the monarchy's neutrality was intolerable. Principle had to come before political preference. Sir Richard Pemberton, a conservative member of Parliament known for his pro-American stance, gave a speech that surprised many of his colleagues. He praised America and the special relationship between the two nations. But he also said clearly that respect must go both ways. "We respect American democracy," he said, "and we expect America to respect our constitutional arrangements in return." The speech was remarkable because Sir Richard had been one of Trump's few defenders in Parliament. He had argued that the president's unconventional style was refreshing, that his challenges to political correctness were needed. But on this issue, he drew a line. Some principles were not negotiable. His speech resonated with other conservatives who had been struggling with the same tension. They began speaking up, carefully separating their general support for conservative policies from their condemnation of pressure on the monarchy. It was possible, they argued, to like someone's policies while disapproving of their conduct. Meanwhile, on the progressive side of British politics, something equally surprising was happening. Many Labour MPs and left-leaning activists had long been critical of the monarchy, seeing it as an outdated symbol of class privilege. Some had called for Britain to become a republic, but now these same people found themselves defending the monarchy's constitutional role, not because they suddenly loved the institution, but because they recognized that the principle of political neutrality mattered. If foreign leaders could pressure constitutional institutions, no democratic system was safe. A Labour MP gave an interview where she explained this position. "I may question whether we need a monarchy in the long term," she said, "but while we have one, its political independence is crucial. This is not about defending privilege. It's about defending constitutional democracy from foreign manipulation." This created a strange situation where Republicans were defending the monarchy and monarchists were criticizing a conservative foreign leader. Political categories that usually defined British debate were becoming scrambled. Across the Atlantic, the alliances were just as unexpected. Progressive Americans, many of whom had been critical of both Trump and the concept of monarchy, found themselves supporting the principle Thornberry defended. They did not care about protecting kings and queens, but they cared deeply about respecting other nations' democratic systems. Former President Obama's statement had set the tone. Without taking a partisan stance, he had emphasized the importance of diplomatic respect and understanding other countries' constitutional frameworks. This resonated with Americans who believed in international cooperation and rule-based order. But support for Thornberry's position also came from unexpected conservative quarters. Some traditional conservative intellectuals, the kind who valued institutions and norms over populist disruption, spoke up about the importance of diplomatic protocol. One prominent conservative writer published an essay titled "Why Constitutional Conservatives Should Care About Constitutional Monarchy." He argued that conservatism was supposed to be about respecting institutions and traditions, not tearing them down. If conservatives in America did not respect Britain's constitutional traditions, how could they claim to value American constitutional traditions? This created tensions within the conservative movement. Populist conservatives saw the whole controversy as elites attacking Trump for not following their stuffy rules. Traditional institutional conservatives saw it as defending the very concept of constitutional limits on power. The debate exposed deep divisions about what conservatism meant in the modern era. Some of Trump's former administration officials found themselves in particularly difficult positions. They had served in his government and generally supported his agenda, but they also understood diplomatic norms and had sometimes been uncomfortable with how the president approached foreign relations. A former National Security Council member gave an interview to a major newspaper. Speaking carefully, he acknowledged that the president sometimes pushed boundaries in diplomatic settings. He saw it as negotiation, the official explained. Everything was transactional to him. He did not always understand that some things are not supposed to be negotiated. The official did not confirm the specific allegations about the British visit, but he painted a picture consistent with Thornberry's testimony. More importantly, he suggested that staff had sometimes worried about exactly these kinds of incidents but had struggled to prevent them. International relations experts also formed unexpected coalitions. Scholars who disagreed about almost everything else in foreign policy found common ground on the importance of diplomatic protocols. Realists and idealists, hawks and doves, all agreed that state visits needed to respect host nations' constitutional systems. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace organized a symposium that brought together foreign policy thinkers from across the political spectrum. They discussed what the Thornberry incident revealed about changing diplomatic norms and how to protect institutional boundaries in an era of populist leadership. One of the most interesting alliances formed around the specific question of protecting constitutional monarchies. American constitutional scholars who spent their careers studying Republican government found themselves working with British constitutional experts who specialized in monarchy. Together, they explored how different democratic systems could protect themselves from foreign interference. They produced a joint paper arguing that all constitutional democracies, whether monarchies or republics, depended on certain institutions remaining above partisan politics. Courts, electoral systems, head of state functions all needed protection from manipulation. The specific form of government mattered less than the principle of institutional independence. This academic alliance led to practical proposals. They suggested that international organizations develop clearer guidelines for protecting constitutional institutions during diplomatic interactions. They recommended that foreign service training include more emphasis on respecting host nations' constitutional arrangements. Some religious leaders also weighed in on the controversy, creating their own unexpected coalition. A group of British bishops and American clergy members, representing different denominations and theological traditions, issued a joint statement about the moral dimensions of the incident. They framed it as a question of integrity and respect. When we visit someone's home, they wrote, we respect their house rules. The same principle applies to nations. Respecting another country's constitutional principles is not just good diplomacy. It is a moral obligation. This religious perspective resonated with many people who were not particularly interested in constitutional law or diplomatic protocols, but who understood the basic ethical principle involved. You do not try to manipulate your host. You do not pressure people who have extended hospitality to you. The environmental movement also found relevance in the Thornberry case, oddly enough. Climate activists pointed out that international cooperation on issues like climate change required trust and respect for each other's political systems. If world leaders could not be trusted to respect basic diplomatic norms, how could they be trusted to work together on existential threats? This connection seemed like a stretch to some observers, but it reflected how the incident had become a symbol for broader questions about international cooperation and institutional respect. Different groups were finding their own meanings in the story, connecting it to their own concerns and values. In newsrooms, editorial boards that usually took predictable positions struggled with how to respond. Conservative newspapers that generally supported Trump found themselves critical of his alleged behavior. Liberal newspapers that opposed Trump found themselves defending the monarchy, an institution many of their readers questioned. The result was opinion pages that looked nothing like anyone expected. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial defending the importance of diplomatic protocols. The Guardian published a piece about why constitutional neutrality mattered, even for institutions you might want to reform. Traditional categories were breaking down. Social media reflected these strange alliances too. People who usually argued about everything found themselves agreeing on this one issue. The comment sections under news articles showed progressives and conservatives making the same points, often with surprise at finding themselves on the same side. 6 months after his testimony shook 2 nations, James Thornberry stood in his small garden in the Scottish Highlands, pulling weeds and thinking about how much his life had changed. The media circus had finally died down. The cameras were gone. The phone had stopped ringing every 5 minutes. He could walk to the village shop without being recognized or questioned. The move to Scotland had been necessary. London had become impossible, with reporters still occasionally showing up at his old apartment and neighbors treating him like either a hero or a traitor, depending on their politics. Rachel had suggested they take her parents up on their long-standing offer to use their cottage. It was supposed to be temporary, but James was starting to think it might become permanent. Life in the Highlands was quiet in a way London never had been. James spent his days reading, walking, tending the garden, and slowly coming to terms with everything that had happened. He had time to think, time to process, time to heal from wounds that were not physical but ran deep nonetheless. The official inquiry had concluded 3 months earlier. The final report was careful in its language, typical of government documents that needed to satisfy multiple audiences. It confirmed that the incident James described had occurred. It stated that President Trump's behavior had been inappropriate and unprecedented during the state visit. But it stopped short of saying any laws had been broken. The report recommended new protocols for state visits. Foreign leaders would now receive more detailed briefings about British constitutional principles before their visits. Staff would be encouraged to report potential violations of diplomatic protocol without fear of retaliation. There would be clearer procedures for handling incidents when they occurred. These were modest changes, but they mattered. They meant that what James had done, what he had sacrificed for, had led to real improvements. Future guards would have better guidance and more support if they witnessed similar problems. The system had learned and adapted. For James personally, the outcome was more complicated. He had been quietly allowed to resign from the Queen's Guard with full honors. There would be no formal reprimand on his record, no public censure. But everyone understood that he could never return to that role. His testimony had changed how people saw him, and some bridges could not be uncrossed. The resignation had been painful, but also, in a strange way, liberating. James had spent 23 years following orders, maintaining silence, being part of a tradition larger than himself. Now he was free to define his own path, to figure out who he was beyond the uniform. The palace had been surprisingly supportive in the end. A senior advisor had visited James privately before he moved to Scotland. The advisor could not say much officially, but he conveyed that certain people within the royal household respected what James had done. They understood that protecting the institution sometimes meant making difficult choices. The advisor also brought something unexpected, a private letter of commendation from the king himself. The letter would never be made public, could never be shown to anyone, but it thanked James for his service and his integrity. It acknowledged the personal cost he had paid and expressed respect for the principles he had defended. James had read that letter a dozen times. It meant more to him than any public recognition could have. It confirmed that he had not betrayed the institution he had served. He had protected it in the way it most needed protecting. That knowledge helped ease some of the doubt and guilt he had carried. Rachel had adjusted to their new life better than James had expected. She had taken a job at a local school, teaching children who had no idea who her husband was or what he had done. She liked the simplicity of it, the return to normal life after months of chaos. Her relationship with James was healing too, slowly rebuilding trust and understanding. Their daughter had found the whole experience hardest. Teenagers are often embarrassed by their parents under normal circumstances, and having your father become an international news story was definitely not normal. But time and distance had helped. She was starting to see her father not just as an embarrassment, but as someone who had stood up for what he believed in, even when it cost him everything. James had started writing his memoirs, though he was not sure he would ever publish them. The process of writing helped him make sense of his experience and find some peace with his choices. He wrote honestly about his doubts, his fears, the nights he lay awake wondering if he was doing the right thing. A literary agent had reached out about publishing the memoir. The agent promised it could be a bestseller, that people wanted to hear James's story in his own words. But James was hesitant. He had not spoken up to become famous or to make money. Publishing a memoir felt like it might cheapen what he had done. Still, he kept writing, thinking maybe someday, when enough time had passed, it might be worth sharing. Not as a political statement or an accusation, but as a story about ordinary people facing extraordinary moral choices, about what it means to serve something larger than yourself and what you do when serving that institution requires breaking its rules. The broader impact of James's testimony continued to unfold in ways he was only dimly aware of. In diplomatic training programs around the world, the case was now taught as an example of what could go wrong when protocol was ignored. Future diplomats studied it to understand why seemingly stuffy rules about state visits actually served important purposes. Several countries had updated their protocols for hosting foreign leaders, specifically adding provisions about protecting constitutional institutions from political pressure. The United Nations had issued new guidance on diplomatic conduct. These changes were technical and bureaucratic, unlikely to make headlines, but they would shape how nations interacted for years to come. In Britain, the Queen's Guard had implemented new training programs. Young guards now received education not just on security procedures, but on constitutional principles. They learned about the history of royal political neutrality and why it mattered. They were taught that protecting the crown sometimes meant more than physical protection. Most importantly, they learned about the Thornbury precedent, as it had become known. The precedent established that there were circumstances where speaking up about violations of constitutional principles was not just acceptable, but necessary. Guards were encouraged to report serious concerns through proper channels, and those channels had been strengthened to ensure reports were taken seriously. James occasionally received letters from young people who had heard his story and were inspired by it. Some were considering careers in public service and wanted to know how to navigate ethical dilemmas. Others were just ordinary people who had faced difficult choices in their own lives and found comfort in knowing someone else had struggled with similar questions. He tried to answer these letters when he could, though he was never quite sure what to say. He was not a moral philosopher or an ethics expert. He was just someone who had faced an impossible choice and done what he thought was right. He could not tell others what they should do in their situations, but he could share his experience and hope it helped. The political fallout had continued long after the inquiry concluded. In America, the incident had become part of the larger debate about Trump's presidency. Supporters dismissed it as overblown. Critics pointed to it as another example of his disregard for norms and institutions. The truth, as usual, was probably more nuanced than either extreme admitted. Trump himself had never fully addressed the allegations. He had called them false, complained about political persecution, and moved on to other topics. His most loyal supporters had followed his lead, treating the whole thing as a media-created scandal. But polling suggested that the incident had affected how some moderate voters viewed his approach to international relations. In Britain, the incident had strengthened public support for maintaining the monarchy's political neutrality. Surveys showed increased understanding of why this principle mattered, and stronger opposition to any attempts to draw royals into political debates. Ironically, the attempt to compromise the monarchy's neutrality had ended up reinforcing it. Historians were already beginning to assess the incident's place in the broader story of Anglo-American relations. Some argued it represented a low point, a moment when the special relationship came under serious strain. Others suggested it ultimately strengthened the relationship by clarifying boundaries and expectations. What seemed clear was that the incident had exposed tensions that had been building for years. As international politics became more populist and confrontational, traditional diplomatic norms were under pressure. The Thornbury case had forced a reckoning with what those norms meant and why they existed. James thought about all of this sometimes, usually late at night when sleep would not come. He wondered if his testimony had really changed anything, or if it had just been a brief scandal that people would forget. He hoped that the protocol changes were real and lasting, that future generations would benefit from the painful lessons learned. But mostly, he tried not to think about it too much. He focused on the garden, on the rhythm of simple tasks, on rebuilding a life that was quieter but perhaps more authentic than what he had before. He had learned that you cannot control how history remembers,